book up to date, or to point out and detail all the changes that have taken place since 1844. And for two reasons: firstly, to do this properly, the size of the book must be about doubled, and, secondly, the first volume of Das Kapital, by Karl Marx, an English translation of which is before the public, contains a very ample description of the state of the British working class, as it was about 1865, that is to say, at the time when British industrial prosperity reached its culminating point. I should, then, have been obliged again to go over the ground already covered by Marx's celebrated work. It will be hardly necessary to point out that the general theoretical standpoint of this book, philosophical, economical, political, does not exactly coincide with my standpoint of today. Modern international socialism, since fully developed as a science, chiefly and almost exclusively through the efforts of Marx, did not as yet exist in 1844. My book represents one of the phases of its embryonic development, and as the human embryo, in its early stages, still reproduces the gill arches of our fish ancestors, so this book exhibits everywhere the traces of the descent of modern socialism from one of its ancestors, German philosophy. Thus great stress is laid on the dictum that communism is not a mere party doctrine of the working class, but a theory compassing the emancipation of society at large, including the capitalist class, from its present narrow conditions. This is true enough in the abstract, but absolutely useless, and sometimes worse, in practice. So long as the wealthy classes not only do not feel the want of any emancipation, but strenuously oppose the self-emancipation of the working class, so long the social revolution will have to be prepared, and fought out by the working class alone. The French bourgeois of 1789 too declared the emancipation of the bourgeoisie to be the emancipation of the whole human race, but the nobility and clergy would not see it. The proposition, though for the time being, with respect to feudalism, an abstract historical truth, soon became a mere sentimentalism, and disappeared from view altogether in the fire of the revolutionary struggle. And today, the very people who, from the impartiality of their superior standpoint, preach to the workers a socialism soaring high above their class interests and class struggles, and tending to reconcile in a higher humanity the interests of both the contending classes, these people are either neophytes, who have still to learn a great deal, or they are the worst enemies of the workers, wolves in sheep's clothing. The recurring period of the great industrial crisis is stated in the text as 5 years. This was the period apparently indicated by the course of events from 1825 to 1842. But the industrial history from 1842 to 1868 has shown that the real period is one of 10 years, that the intermediate revulsions were secondary, and tended more and more to disappear. Since 1868 the state of things has changed again, of which more anonymous. I have taken care not to strike out of the text the many prophecies, amongst others that of an imminent social revolution in England, which my youthful ardour induced me to venture upon. The wonder is, not that a good many of them proved wrong, but that so many of them have proved right, and that the critical state of English trade, to be brought on by continental, and especially American competition, which I then foresaw, though in too short a period, has now actually come to pass. In this respect I can, and am bound to, bring the book up to date, by placing here an article which I published in the London Commonweal of March 1, 1885, under the heading England in 1845, and in 1885. It gives at the same time a short outline of the history of the English working class during these 40 years, and is as follows. 40 years ago England stood face to face with a crisis, solvable to all appearances by force only. The immense and rapid development of manufactures had outstripped the extension of foreign markets and the increase of demand. Every 10 years the march of industry was violently interrupted by a general commercial crash, followed, after a long period of chronic depression, by a few short years of prosperity, and always ending in feverish overproduction and consequent renewed collapse. The capitalist class clamored for free trade in corn, and threatened to enforce it, by sending the starving population of the towns back to the country districts whence they came, to invade them, as John Bright said, not as paupers begging for bread, but as an army quartered upon the enemy. The working masses of the towns demanded their share of political power, the People's Charter. They were supported by the majority of the small trading class, and the only difference between the two was whether the charter should be carried by physical or by moral force. Then came the commercial crash of 1847 and the Irish famine, and with both the prospect of revolution. The French Revolution of 1848 saved the English middle class. The socialistic pronunciamentos of the victorious French workmen frightened the small middle class of England, and disorganized the narrower, but more matter-of-fact movement of the English working class. At the very moment when Chartism was bound to assert itself in its full strength, it collapsed internally, before even it collapsed externally on the 10th of April, 1848. The action of the working class was thrust into the background. The capitalist class triumphed along the whole line. The Reform Bill of 1831 had been the victory of the whole capitalist class over the landed aristocracy. The repeal of the Corn Laws was the victory of the manufacturing capitalists not only over the landed aristocracy, but over those sections of capitalists too, whose interests were more or less bound up with the landed interest, bankers, stock jobbers, fund holders, etc. Free trade meant the readjustment of the whole home and foreign, commercial, and financial policy of England in accordance with the interests of the manufacturing capitalists, the class which now represented the nation. And they set about this task with a will. Every obstacle to industrial production was mercilessly removed. The tariff and the whole system of taxation were revolutionized. Everything was made subordinate to one end, but that end of the utmost importance to the manufacturing capitalist, the cheapening of all raw produce, and especially of the means of living of the working class, the reduction of the cost of raw material, and the keeping down, if not as yet the bringing down, of wages. England was to become the workshop of the world. All other countries were to become for England, what Ireland already was, markets for her manufactured goods, supplying her in return with raw materials and food. England, the great manufacturing centre of an agricultural world, with an ever-increasing number of corn and cotton-growing islands revolving around her, the industrial sun. What a glorious prospect! The manufacturing capitalists set about the realization of this their great object with that strong common sense and that contempt for traditional principles which has ever distinguished them from their more narrow-minded compeers on the continent. Chartism was dying out. The revival of commercial prosperity, natural after the revulsion of 1847 had spent itself, was put down altogether to the credit of free trade. Both these circumstances had turned the English working class, politically, into the tail of the great Liberal Party, the party led by the manufacturers. This advantage, once gained, had to be perpetuated. And the manufacturing capitalists, from the Chartist opposition, not to free trade, but to the transformation of free trade into the one vital national question, had learnt, and were learning more and more, that the middle class can never obtain full social and political power over the nation, except by the help of the working class. Thus a gradual change came over the relations between both classes. The Factory Acts, once the bugbear of all manufacturers, were not only willingly submitted to, but their expansion into acts regulating almost all trades, was tolerated. Trades unions, hitherto considered inventions of the devil himself, were now petted and patronized as perfectly legitimate institutions, and as useful means of spreading sound economical doctrines amongst the workers. Even strikes, than which nothing had been more nefarious up to 1848, were now gradually found out to be occasionally very useful, especially when provoked by the masters themselves, at their own time. Of the legal enactments, placing the workman at a lower level, or at a disadvantage with regard to the master, at least the most revolting were repealed. And, practically, that horrid People's Charter actually became the political program of the very manufacturers who had opposed it to the last. The abolition of the property qualification and vote by ballot, are now the law of the land. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 make a near approach to universal suffrage, at least such as it now exists in Germany. The Redistribution Bill now before Parliament creates equal electoral districts, on the whole not more unequal than those of Germany, payment of members, and shorter, if not actually annual parliaments, are visibly looming in the distance, and yet there are people who say that Chartism is dead. The Revolution of 1848, not less than many of its predecessors, has had strange bedfellows and successors. The very people who put it down have become, as Karl Marx used to say, its testamentary executors. Louis Napoleon had to create an independent and united Italy, Bismarck had to revolutionize Germany and to restore Hungarian independence, and the English manufacturers had to enact the People's Charter. For England, the effects of this domination of the manufacturing capitalists were at first startling. Trade revived and extended to a degree unheard